The smell of ether still haunts the walls of the long-abandoned townhouse on Cheapside Lane, though no chemical has touched its halls in nearly 2 centuries. Locals say it is only mildew, old brick sweating through damp winters. Yet those who have stepped across its threshold describe something sharper, something that cuts into the lungs like a surgeon's scalpel. The house once belonged to Dr. Horace Willoughby, a man celebrated in his own lifetime as a healer and visionary, but remembered now in whispers as something far darker. His methods promised progress. His wards were filled with mothers desperate for care. His ledger documented miracles and medical wonders. But the parish records spoke of infants who vanished without burial, mothers who swore their children were not their own, and blank certificates signed with trembling hands. What happened inside Dr. Willoughby's laboratory would shock a city already blackened by smog and sorrow. It was there, in the year 1824, that medicine and madness intertwined. Before we go further into this account, subscribe to this channel for more chilling tales from history's forgotten shadows. London, 1824. The city roared like a beast that never slept. Its heartbeat in the rattle of wheels against cobblestones, in the hiss of gas lamps that painted damp alleys in thin yellow light, in the cries of hawkers and beggars whose voices mixed in endless chorus. Fog rolled from the Thames and clung to narrow streets already heavy with coal smoke and the scent of horse dung. The larger avenues boasted tall townhouses of brick and stone, proud and proper, their door knockers polished, curtains drawn against the misery outside. But in the shadows between, London revealed itself in its most valid form. Cramped tenements, stinking courtyards, and fever wards where the poor sickened and died unnoticed. It was a city torn asunder, pulled violently in 2 directions, progress and decay. On one end of Cheapside Lane, newspapers boasted of triumphs, steam engines, surgical breakthroughs, and even whispers of vaccination spreading to the farthest colonies. On the other end, undertakers piled coffins upon carts, children starved, and the stench of disease refused to yield to science. This stark dichotomy cast a shadow of uncertainty over the city, a tension that was palpable in every alley and street corner. He was a man of striking composure, tall and angular, with features that might have been handsome if not for the way his eyes lingered longer than politeness allowed. His hair was prematurely silver, his skin pale as if he spent more time in candlelight than under the sun. In conversation, his voice carried a peculiar weight, a softness that drew people in, as though each syllable concealed a secret only he would share. To the desperate and the hopeful, that voice carried the promise of relief. Horace Willoughby had risen quickly in medical society. Born the son of a clergyman, educated at Guy's Hospital, he acquired a reputation for diligence and unflinching curiosity. He was known to accept patients of every station, from alderpersons to laundresses, provided they allowed him to record their cases in meticulous detail. His ledger contained descriptions sharper than any scalpel, pulse rates, temperatures, sketches of tumors and swellings, and theories that often strayed beyond accepted practice. Many praised him for this dedication. Others whispered that Willoughby sought not cures but curiosities. The year 1824 was one of unease in London's medical world. Childbirth remained a gamble with death for the mother, the child, or both. Midwives still outnumbered physicians, and even in respectable households, babies slipped into stillness with alarming frequency. People experiencing poverty fared worse still, giving birth in damp corners, often with nothing but rags to swaddle the infant. It was into this domain of suffering that Willoughby stepped, offering mothers something they had rarely known: the promise of safety, of cleanliness, of care delivered under the eyes of science. Yet this promise was overshadowed by the mounting unease and fear that gripped the city. Women came from across the city, clutching coins, pawn slips, or scraps of jewelry to pay for his services. The clinic advertised a single assurance: no woman in pain shall be turned away. It sounded like kindness, and perhaps it was. Yet the mothers who left often returned weeks later, haunted, insisting the infant in their arms was not the child they had birthed. The ears were shaped differently, the lips fuller, the skin of another hue. Some agreed to remain silent, soothed by explanations of swelling or discoloration. Others grew louder in their protests. Their complaints were met with a physician's calm denial, bolstered by clerks whose ledgers bore neat handwriting and parish officials who signed without question. Behind the clinic stood a rear wing, hastily built with funds that no one could quite trace. There, neighbors reported a constant glow of lamplight even at midnight, and strange cries, sometimes infant wails, sometimes silence too oppressive to be mistaken. Deliveries of chemicals arrived through back doors, carboys of acid, jars of preservative spirits, bundles carried in wrapped paper that clinked like surgical instruments. The servant spoke only in murmurs, and those who sought employment often left within weeks, some too shaken to explain why. The enigma of this wing, shrouded in secrecy and whispers, was a puzzle that begged to be solved. The truth of Willoughby's work, however, unfolded slowly. In his lecture notes, preserved long after his disappearance, he frequently wrote about the boundaries between life and death, as well as the fleeting moments that determined survival. "An infant born weak," he scrawled in ink that bled across heavy paper, "may yet borrow strength if supplemented, if processes are transferred, if vitality itself might be encouraged across thresholds." The words seemed scientific only in tone. Their meaning was at once visionary and grotesque. One case, whispered in Lambeth and recorded years later, involved the parish records of Sarah Minton, a cobbler's wife. She had delivered a son at Cheapside, her third child after two had died in infancy. The baby was pale, unresponsive, and pronounced unlikely to survive the night. Yet days later, Sarah left the clinic holding a vigorous infant whose eyes shone dark and bright. She praised Willoughby to her neighbors for restoring life. But her sister remarked, half in jest, that the child did not resemble her or her husband and bore the curious scent of spirit solution. By spring, Sarah's baby thrived, but another woman in the same district buried a child she swore was not hers. Such patterns arose repeatedly in Bethnal Green. A mother who gave birth to a girl was often left with a boy. In Whitechapel, an infant with a birthmark was returned without it. In Clerkenwell, twins were born, though only one was ever presented. The inconsistencies were waved away with medical authority, justified by the chaos of childbirth. But the murmurs multiplied. Still, Willoughby's reputation grew. He spoke at meetings of the Royal Society, delivered papers on infant vitality at the Apothecaries' Hall, and lunched with alderpersons who praised his devotion to people experiencing poverty. He used language that elevated suffering into theory, replacing, supplementing, and strengthening it. He insisted the frontier of science lay not in preserving life as found, but in crafting life as it might be. In a city where bread could be adulterated with chalk and gin flowed cheaper than water, such visions drew both fascination and terror. Progress clashed with superstition. Contagious disease confronted radical experimentation. And at the center of this war stood Horace Willoughby, celebrated for compassion, yet whispered of for scandal. The climax of suspicion was not a single case, but a pattern. It began with ledgers. A parish clerk in Southwark noted discrepancies. Births recorded without baptisms, baptisms without burials, mothers insistent that their infants were alive, even as records marked them dead. He traced names, followed signatures, and returned repeatedly to the address at Cheapside. He confronted Willoughby, who smiled with a surgeon's composure and explained a clerical error. The clerk pressed further but soon resigned from his post, citing ill health. Yet rumors survived him. A gravedigger in St. Bride's swore that small coffins brought from Cheapside seemed curiously weighted. A laundress spoke of washing linen stained with something thicker than blood. One midwife, dismissed abruptly after assisting at the clinic, described a locked room where she saw glass vessels containing indistinct forms suspended in amber liquid. To walk past Cheapside Lane in those days was to encounter a duality. Mothers entering with hope, mothers leaving with unease, and above it all, the flicker of candlelight that never seemed to rest. The truth, as it would come to be pieced together, was far darker than any passing rumor. But dark truths are rarely uncovered at once. They emerge through fragments stitched by those brave enough to notice. Among these was a young porter named Thomas Gray, whose employment at the clinic placed him on the threshold of observation. His recollections, recorded decades later, described his first delivery of a package not to a patient's home, but to the anatomical rooms at a university. Within the box were small remains, labeled as specimens. The porter did not ask questions at the time, but memory has a way of knowing, and when years passed, he realized the specimens matched the infants whose mothers had wept in the corridors of Cheapside. It is here, in the uncertainty of London's fog, that our story settles. A doctor lauded for benevolence, a city desperate for cures, and behind it all, the unspoken suspicion of lives exchanged like currency. The staging is complete. The house still stands in record, if not in body, and its corridors whisper with questions no parish priest could answer. We now turn to the hidden chapters of Willoughby's career, where the exchange of life and death revealed itself not as a miracle, but as a crime. By the closing months of 1824, Dr. Horace Willoughby had secured his place among the fashionable physicians of London. To the papers, he was a man of quiet genius, beloved by both the destitute and the wealthy, a servant of progress in an age that demanded miracles. To his peers at the Royal College of Surgeons, however, murmurs began to stir. Medicine in London was a contentious field, divided between the guardians of tradition and the apostles of innovation. Where one surgeon swore by leeches, another demanded the knife. Where one physician recommended prayer and wine, another reached for opium and dissection. It was fertile ground for a new star to rise, and Willoughby cultivated his image with deliberate care. He maintained two faces, much like the city itself. In parlors of wealthy patrons, he spoke with grace about cleanliness, ventilation, and sound nutrition. He championed fresh air for children and sunlight for mothers, ideas that won admiration among reformers. But in the shadowed wards of his clinic, he spoke another language, one that only his ledger could faithfully record. There, hidden behind polished brass and white curtains, Willoughby advanced a conviction he never dared present openly, that infants were at once fragile and interchangeable, mere vessels upon which experiments might be tested. The word experiment in those years held the shimmer of progress. The Enlightenment had given way to industrial wonders. Science was worshipped with the fervor of religion. Yet in practice, experiments often meant cruelty. Bloodletting, purges, blistering, and crude surgeries maimed more often than they cured. Still, the public believed, for hope has always outweighed horror. And in that fragile imbalance between desperation and trust, Willoughby thrived. Mothers arrived at Cheapside, drawn by the promise of safety. They were shown neat rooms, linen freshly laundered, windows open to pale daylight. They saw order and cleanliness, yet failed to notice the locks on certain doors and the peculiar silence in specific corridors. When their labors began, they were offered strange tonics with a bitter flavor, followed by unconscious slumbers under the haze of ether. They awoke exhausted, clutching an infant pressed into their arms. Few had the strength, or perhaps the courage, to question whether that infant was truly their own. And for those who did raise their voices, there was Willoughby's calm, his measured phrases, his insistence that exhaustion clouded their perception. It was not every mother who was deceived, for Willoughby could not risk suspicion in every case. Some delivered naturally, their infants swaddled beneath watchful eyes. Others, however, were selected, chosen with a precision that suggested criteria beyond chance. The infants who vanished were those marked fragile, small, or malformed. Their mothers were poor, with no power to pursue questions before the parish or the law, and the replacements given in their arms bore signs of vigor, of health, as though carefully chosen from a different source. The replaced infants, however, were not always accounted for by chance. In his notebook, confiscated long after his disappearance, Willoughby described attempts to exchange, pair, and replicate vitality. Tight script bled across margins. Subject A expired on the third day. Transfer incomplete. Further observation required, or infant sturdy though not of the mother. The maternal bond is unstable. Further refinement of the process is necessary. The words were cold, devoid of tenderness, written as though describing livestock. Those closest to the clinic began to sense the weight of something hidden. Thomas Gray, the porter, recalled that strange stains clung to the steps leading to the cellar, brown flecks that no amount of scrubbing seemed to remove. The laundress employed for linens muttered that the sheets were steeped more in the odor of chemical preservative than in blood. A dismissed maid whispered that voices of infants lingered behind locked doors, though she dared not open them. At will, Willoughby visited the parlors of the affluent, arriving with perfect posture and steady composure. There, among candles and satin, he told stories of his charitable clinic, of children spared death by the hand of science. He was received as a curiosity, even admired. When Lady Abigail Worthing lost her third child to fever, she welcomed Willoughby's counsel. When the Duchess of Somerset hosted gatherings, she would place him at the table to discuss progress. To question his methods became socially unfashionable. To praise his compassion was virtuous. Thus, while whispers spread among people with low incomes, his reputation among the elite grew untouchable. But London does not keep secrets forever. In winter, a case arose that began to pierce the facade. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, wife of a bookseller, went into labor under Willoughby's care. The infant, a boy, seemed stillborn at birth. Eleanor, weary and grief-stricken, fell into unconsciousness. But she later awoke to find a living child at her side, albeit one whose features bore no likeness to her family. She was told the shock had confused her, that the boy was indeed hers, saved by vigorous resuscitation. Yet in her heart suspicion burned. Weeks later, at baptism, Eleanor hesitated to sign the registry, declaring aloud before witnesses that the infant could not be of her blood. The matter might have died as one more poor mother's grief, but Eleanor was no illiterate laundress. She wrote letters, many of them, to parish officials, to editors of obscure papers, to the city coroner's office. Most went unanswered, dismissed as the ramblings of a woman unhinged by sorrow. But one letter reached the desk of a medical examiner who had once been Willoughby's peer at Guy's Hospital. That man, Dr. Jonathan Hervey, did not dismiss her claim so easily. He remembered Willoughby's peculiar obsessions with the exchange of vitality, his relentless note-taking, his unsettling way of describing patients not as individuals, but as specimens, seeking discretion. Hervey visited Cheapside Lane without prior notice. There he encountered the polished brass plate, the clean curtains, and the pleasant entry hall that concealed so much. Willoughby greeted him with practiced geniality, flattering his colleagues' achievements, offering tea and measured conversation. Hervey observed nothing overt, but when he asked casually about Eleanor Whitcomb's case, Willoughby's expression altered for a breath too long. He brushed aside the question with professional calm, but Hervey's suspicions sharpened. Meanwhile, in the lower quarters of London, stories multiplied. Mothers whispered in markets that the infants they carried were altered, exchanged. Some noticed that birthmarks had vanished, while others swore that the color of their eyes had shifted. These tales were dismissed as superstition by men of learning, but within the silence of cramped tenements, they grew louder. No one knew how many could be trusted, for sorrow distorts memory, and childbirth often plunges women into confusion. Yet it was undeniable that too many complaints emerged from one address, Cheapside Lane. What truly occurred within those locked rooms is difficult to reconstruct, and perhaps it is fortunate that much remains shrouded in mystery. Yet fragments survived in journals, testimonies, and in one surviving notebook that later slipped into the hands of investigators. In it, Willoughby outlined procedures he called transpositions. His theory suggested that life, particularly infant life, could be strengthened by substitution. A weak child, faltering at the edge of death, might be infused with vitality by being exchanged with a stronger one, while still retaining its essential spirit through maternal influence. It was, of course, madness disguised in ink. The notes described things coldly and clinically, including incisions, the application of blood between infants, exposure to chemicals, and attempts to preserve organs in solutions. Many of these attempts ultimately failed. The notebook coolly recorded expiration times. Infant ceased crying after 3 hours, subject dead by morning. Yet Willoughby pursued them with obsessive zeal. Believing himself on the verge of discovery, he seemed unconcerned with mother's anguish, regarding them merely as obstacles to be soothed or silenced. The most chilling entries reveal that some infants were never returned at all. Instead, they were recorded as donors, their bodies tucked away in jars or dissected for further study. Others, stronger and healthier, were placed in the arms of mothers who never suspected the truth. Thus, the dead and the living, the weak and the strong, were shifted as neatly as ledger balances. By late 1824, more than 60 births had passed through Cheapside Lane. Parish records reveal an improbable survival rate, significantly higher than that of any comparable practice in London. To the unknowing, it was proof of Willoughby's brilliance. To those whose suspicions sharpened, it was evidence of something far worse. The parish clerk who had first questioned the records fell mysteriously ill and departed London. Eleanor Whitcomb continued to spread her account, but she was drowned out by the chorus of grateful mothers whose babies lived. Yet, beneath the accolades, tension was gathering. Servants whispered of jars filled with cloudy spirits, of cries from unseen chambers. One apprentice, dismissed abruptly, described dark blood pooled upon stone floors. By the winter's end, the truth of Horace Willoughby's experiments trembled on the edge of revelation. He remained a man celebrated in drawing rooms, praised in journals, whispered of in poverty-stricken alleys. But shadows lengthened, and the doctor's composure began to falter, for within the walls of his clinic, the cries of the vanished could not forever be silenced. By the spring of 1825, Horace Willoughby stood balanced precariously between acclaim and suspicion. His clinic was thriving, his name whispered in both aristocratic parlors and impoverished market lanes. Yet unease hung over Cheapside Lane like the fog that never lifted from the Thames. No matter how brightly he polished brass or how carefully he spoke of charity, the shadows within his walls deepened. The evidence of his experiments was everywhere for those who dared to look. Patients noted the heavy locks on cellar doors. Neighbors spoke of strange deliveries arriving at night, crates that rattled with glass, barrels that leaked curious-smelling liquids into the cobblestones. More than once, a ragged child trespassing in search of scraps bolted shrieking from the yard, insisting he had heard the cries of babies where no babies should be. Willoughby himself was changing, and those closest to him noted it. His appearance grew gaunt, his coat collars looser about his neck, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Yet he carried himself with iron composure, pressing always forward with his theories. If asked about his health, he smiled faintly and murmured, "It is the cost of discovery. Nature yields her secrets only to those willing to labor endlessly in her dissection. But nature has a way of unsettling the minds that probe her too far." In his private notes, heavy with violet ink, Willoughby's tone became urgent, even frantic. Failures mounted. He wrote of infants who fought violently, who convulsed when subjected to his procedures. He noted discolorations, strange swellings, and sudden silences that left him pacing long after the lamps were extinguished. He began to record not names but numbers. Subject 8, Subject 11, as though stripping any vestige of humanity made their loss tolerable. Yet in margins he scrawled fragments of guilt. They cry in dreams. They call to mothers who shall never touch them again. Despite these notes, the outward facade continued. Mothers in drawing rooms shared tales of the miracle doctor of Cheapside. Newspapers, ever eager for stories of progress, praised the survival rate of his infants. Even the Royal Society received his carefully written pamphlets, though they published none, for the theories struck too close to blasphemy. Still, praise nourished him, and desperation shielded him from doubt. Then came the case that marked the beginning of the slow unmasking. A woman named Margaret Holbrook arrived at the clinic in May, a seamstress by trade, her fingers stained with the black of cheap dyes. Her husband had died in a fall from scaffolding, leaving her penniless save for the child in her belly. When her time came, she was admitted into Willoughby's care. She labored for many hours before collapsing into deep unconsciousness under ether. When she awoke, she found a child at her breast, a child with a face she swore was not hers. Margaret did not remain silent. She wailed. She clutched the infant in terror, declaring it strange to her, begging to see the body of the child she believed she had delivered. Willoughby entered the chamber with trained serenity. He soothed her, spoke of exhaustion clouding her memory, of features altered in the swelling of birth. He laid his pale hand upon hers and promised her she was mistaken. Some mothers accepted this assurance despite being weary. Margaret did not. Her protests reached her parish. Neighbors gathered to whisper. The midwife who had watched her during labor recalled that she had seen more than one swaddled infant carried briefly into the room before the final presentation. Doubt began to coil. Still nothing was proven. At every step, authorities shielded Willoughby. Parish clerks hesitated to challenge a gentleman doctor. Mothers who protested were dismissed as hysterical. Yet rumors spread like the city fog, thick and inescapable. By midsummer, even the servants of the clinic were uneasy. Several resigned without explanation. A stable boy confided in whispers that he had carried a crate to the river containing not specimens, but the unmistakable weight of a small body. A laundress fainted upon discovering a cloth marked not only by blood but by the bite of teeth too small for adults. And the dismissed apprentice, his name preserved in later accounts as Robert Ashe, gave the first detailed accusation. Ashe claimed to have been summoned to the locked cellar where preserved jars lined the walls. Within, he swore he saw dismembered remains of infants, some limbless, others with eyes clouded in fluid. He reported that Willoughby muttered of success and failure as calmly as one tallying profit and loss. His account was dismissed as madness by some, an invention by others, but once uttered, it could not be recalled. Through all of this, Willoughby pressed on. His notes revealed new ambitions. It was no longer enough to exchange vitality between infants. He wondered if adults might yield strength. He speculated whether blood drawn from robust men might awaken dying children, whether organs could be shifted between lives. "The boundary is illusion," he scribbled. "What one body lacks, another supplies. It is but a transfer, if one dares to attempt." London itself seemed to conspire with this delusion. It was a city accustomed to cruelty, bodies dissected at surgeons' halls, orphans abandoned on doorsteps, paupers dissected in anatomy schools. A few more vanished infants hardly drew notice among the tide of human misery. Yet for those who did notice, who whispered among corridors and markets, the suspicion sharpened daily. Then came the fever incident. In August of that year, a fever swept through the district surrounding Cheapside. Families fell ill, children wasted away in days, mothers perished in handfuls. Yet curiously, the infants within Willoughby's clinic appeared untouched. While coffins multiplied in courtyards, his records showed miraculous survival. Skepticism hardened into anger. People demanded an explanation. Was it divine providence or something unnatural? The tipping point arrived in September, when a coffin prepared under Willoughby's supervision was accidentally dropped while being transferred by porters. The lid shifted, and those standing nearby swore that inside were not the expected wrappings of a stillborn, but stone and sand weightings. The rumor ran like fire. Why had the coffin been empty? Where was the child? Willoughby responded with solemnity, claiming a mistake, a misplacement of records. He compensated the family and soothed their outrage. Yet behind closed doors, his composure broke. In his notes of those days, he wrote, "They circle me like wolves. They sense blood. I must accelerate before discovery overtakes me." From then on, his experiments grew more desperate. Witnesses claimed lamps burned all night in Cheapside Lane, shadows flickered behind curtains, and muffled sounds persisted until dawn. Mothers found themselves drugged more heavily than before, awaking not merely exhausted but disoriented, unable to recall their own labors. Some spoke of glimpsing instruments beside their beds, saws, clamps, tubes glistening with fluid. Even the medical men of London began to grow uneasy. Jonathan Hervey, long suspicious, confided to colleagues that he feared Willoughby was concealing something monstrous. Yet they hesitated to move against him. A gentleman of stature was protected by courtesy and doubt. To accuse him was to risk reputation, to be branded hysterical or envious. Thus, he continued unchecked. However, as with all deceptions, cracks began to widen. One autumn evening, smoke rose from the chimneys of Cheapside, carrying a stench harsher than coal, something acrid, chemical, unbearable. Neighbors gagged in the street, children wept, and when a constable knocked to inquire, he was met with Willoughby's steady denial. A cleaning procedure, nothing more. A petition reached parish authorities soon after, but no action was taken. Still, within those walls, the truth could not be silenced. Servants described the doctor's growing mania. They saw him pacing, muttering about the essence of life, clutching ledgers as though they were scripture. They claimed he had begun making sketches not merely of infants, but of surgical assemblies, diagrams of hearts and lungs connected by tubes. He was forging something far beyond infant substitution. At this point, the actual unraveling began. For even Willoughby, with his calculating mind, could not hide every failure. One winter morning, an infant's corpse was discovered in a refuse pile yards from his clinic, wrapped clumsily in blood-stained cloth. Parish authorities demanded an explanation. He insisted the child had been left at his doorstep, dead already, and discarded by staff without his knowledge. The excuse placated officials momentarily, but the crowd outside his doors grew restless, muttering that whatever miracles Dr. Willoughby claimed, the ground beside Cheapside Lane was soaked in death. By now, his notes reveal a mind unmoored. "I hear them," he wrote, "the failures, the donors. Their cries pierce even in waking hours. Yet I must proceed. The threshold is near. If I cease, they are wasted. If I succeed, all is justified." London was beginning at last to doubt, to whisper more boldly. Mothers hesitated before entering his doors. Yet still, enough desperation remained that the clinic did not empty. Pain and poverty are stubborn shields for deception. But the end was approaching. For no lock, no ledger, no polished brass can forever conceal the rot that festers beneath. By the winter of 1825, London had begun to murmur openly about Dr. Horace Willoughby. Not in the parlors of nobility where reputation was still a shield, but in the alleys, in the markets, in the whispers traded by laundresses hanging linens over freezing courtyards. A name spoken once in awe was now laced with unease. Mothers said aloud what they had once kept hidden. The baby I received was not the baby I bore. Some claimed that their hair color had altered overnight, while others reported that their eye color did not match that of either parent. It no longer seemed mere hysteria. Patterns could be traced. The parish officers, overworked and weary, resisted pursuing the rumors. But the cracks widened still. A scullery maid named Anne Hatherley, refusing to leave quietly after Willoughby dismissed her, went before her priest with a story that curdled his blood. She had seen jars in the cellar containing what she swore were infants or pieces of infants, preserved like grotesque specimens. She described an excellent copper pan in which flesh had been boiled until the odors drove her nearly to madness. The priest, cautious of blasphemy charges should he repeat such things without proof, wrote her tale in his private journal but dared not advance it further. Slowly, however, similar voices began to rise. Thomas Gray, the porter, uneasily confessed his suspicions to an acquaintance in the constabulary. He had carried packages too heavy, crates labeled medical refuse that seemed formed of limbs rather than cloth. He dared not accuse openly. Willoughby was a gentleman with influence, yet the constable, uneasy, began to mark his words. It was not only servants who doubted. Jonathan Hervey, the fellow physician who had grown suspicious months earlier, continued to correspond with colleagues abroad. He recorded his unease in coded letters sent beyond London's reach, scribbles that years later would surface in archives. He speaks of transposition, Hervey wrote, of the shifting of strength from body to body, child to child. The morality of it does not trouble him, I fear, nor does the evidence of failure. I believe he has wandered beyond recall. Even among his patients, tremors of alarm hardened. Margaret Holbrook, the seamstress mother whose protests remained strongest, refused Willoughby's assurances. She carried her infant, whom she swore was not hers, before a parish council and demanded an inquiry. Though the council hesitated, her cries rang beyond closed doors. Women gathered around her. Some nodded in agreement. Others burst into tears, recalling their own births, tainted with strangeness. Collectively, these voices began to matter, but in Willoughby's clinic, the lamp still burned. His obsession had entered a fevered stage. Whatever doubts pressed upon him from outside, within, he still believed himself master of discovery. In his notebooks, his writing became frenzied, uneven. Sentences ran together. The donor was sufficient. Infused, though weak. The new subject stirs. Success? Failure? They wail together as though one voice. He raved of energy transference, of the possibility that spirit might be a substance, transferable as effortlessly as blood. And then came the incident that made silence impossible. It was a bitter night in late December when a rag and bone man, scavenging near the river, discovered a bundle half lodged in the reeds where the Thames lapped black against the stones. The bundle was cloth, carelessly tied, and within it lay the body of an infant. Its small arms were bound clumsily, its torso marked not by disease but by incisions too precise to belong to nature. The rag picker, horrified, reported the finding to parish constables. Whispers turned to alarm. Where had the child come from? Who had done this? The constables traced the cloth wrappings to a laundress long employed by Willoughby's establishment. They asked questions. She stammered answers. She spoke of laundry steeped in chemicals, of cloth she could not bear to touch. She confessed that she had seen Willoughby dispose of bundles late at night. With every word, suspicion deepened, now carried by uniformed men rather than servants' whispers. An inquiry was convened in hushed chambers. The question, could a gentleman physician truly be accused of such horrors, or were these sightings mere invention? London's leading men hesitated, unwilling to disgrace their profession. But before they could dismiss the matter, evidence hardened in another blow. A funeral again, a small coffin carried from the clinic. This time, parish officials, warned by rumor, insisted upon inspection before burial. The coffin was opened and proved empty. There was straw and rock for weight, but not a single scrap of flesh. The officials stared in horror. Mothers shrieked. The whispers exploded into cries. "Where are the children?" The story traveled faster than fire and dry timber. Within days, half of Cheapside spoke openly of Willoughby as a thief of infants. He denied it, of course. With a flat calm, he told the parish men that the coffin had been mistakenly prepared, that the infant had been interred elsewhere. He produced papers, signed and stamped by clerks, to show proper disposal. Yet one of those clerks, when confronted, swore the signature was not his hand. Things unravel quickly once one thread is pulled. Testimonies cropped up in numbers too many to silence. Mothers swore their healthy babies had died only after leaving his clinic. Midwives dismissed the hastily muttered claim of being barred from the final moments of delivery. Neighbors spoke not just of chemical stench, but of cries echoing through shutters into the black London night. By early 1826, Willoughby's name, once gilded, had fallen to near infamy among the poorer districts. Crowds gathered near his doors, muttering and spitting as he passed. He walked with increased caution, his coat buttoned high, his steps brisk. Inside, he drove his servants to silence at the threat of dismissal. And in his journals, paranoia crept. They conspire. They chatter like vermin in walls. But do they know? They cannot. Not yet. I must advance another stage. Proof undeniable. So even they will kneel to me for discovery. Proof, for Willoughby, meant one thing: the human cellar. That hidden wing of his clinic, its doors locked beneath iron and accessible only with keys he kept upon his person at all times, had grown crowded. Shelves lined with jars, crates packed with specimens, remains that once cried for mothers, now catalogued with chilling neatness. Specimen B, lungs inadequately matured. Specimen G, cranial defect, marrow promising. The cellar was his cathedral, his evidence against death itself. And so it was inevitable, for secrets kept in darkness draw more eyes than shadows hide. In March, Thomas Gray resolved to silence his conscience, guided a parish beadle to the rear of Cheapside Lane late at night. There they watched as Willoughby himself hauled a bundle, stained and leaking, into a waiting carriage. They followed, nerves taut with horror. The carriage rattled to the edge of the Thames, where Willoughby threw the bundle into the black waters. The beadle later swore the package shifted with the unmistakable weight of life extinguished too soon. He returned pale, shaken with conviction. Now the matter was undeniable. The parish demanded an investigation. Quietly at first, then fiercely, voices rose that Dr. Horace Willoughby practiced not healing but murder. Still, he clung to the facade. He dined with noble patrons, argued passionately about infant welfare, and cloaked every action under medical necessity. But the cellar waited, and the basement would damn him. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. And so, suspicions marched inevitably toward those iron doors at Cheapside, soon to reveal the horrors that no rhetoric, no ledger, and no polished plate could conceal. The spring of 1826 dawned with a heavy air in London. The city was restless, bruised by poverty, and soot-blackened by its own progress. But in the huddled markets and smoke-thick taverns, conversations seldom strayed far from Cheapside Lane. The murmurs had grown bold. Dr. Horace Willoughby was no miracle worker. He was a thief of children, a butcher in a gentleman's coat, a ripper of innocence long before the city would know that name. On the morning of April 7th, the parish sent a delegation to Willoughby's clinic. They did not announce themselves as patients. They came with authority and suspicion, grim-faced beadles at their side. For days, Willoughby had anticipated such a visit. His journal spoke of approaching wolves and intrusions upon holy work. Yet still he received them with measured politeness, his pale fingers tapping the brass plate as though prestige itself could shield him. He led them through the spotless waiting hall, the tiled floors freshly scrubbed, the linen hanging neatly. He showed them the airy patient rooms, spoke of nutrition, rest, and ether. He offered his ledgers, filled with calligraphy that recorded every name, every delivery, every death. But when they asked for the cellar, his composure faltered. The cellar was not for visitors, he insisted. It was a storage chamber for medical supplies, nothing more. Chemical reagents were dangerous. Instruments were private property. He pressed his point with the authority of a gentleman challenging mere parish officials. Yet the beetles, stirred perhaps by their own recollection of tiny coffins filled with stones, insisted. The iron keys clinked on Willoughby's belt. His knuckles whitened. Accounts differ on what precisely occurred in those moments. Some claimed he refused outright, his voice raised for the first time, his eyes blazing with defiance. Others swore he grew pale, trembling, and surrendered the keys with trembling reluctance. However it happened, the parish men opened the cellar door. A wave of stench rushed upward, thick and chemical, mingled with something fouler, sweet and bitter, that clung to their clothes. Lanterns swung in shaky hands as they descended the stone steps. What met their eyes would haunt them until burial. Rows of shelves stretched wall to wall, upon them jars large and small, filled with cloudy spirits. Within floated fragments that resembled infant limbs, tiny faces misshapen, torsos curled as though in eternal retreat. Labels clung to jars in Willoughby's hand. Specimen D, muscle promising. Specimen K, lungs immature, unsuitable. In crates stacked against damp walls lay cloth bundles that seeped crimson even upon touch. And in the far corner, looming as sentinel of the room, stood the copper pan Anne Hatherley had once described, the vessel scarred with fire, its interior stained dark with what no chemical could wash. The beetles staggered back, one vomiting noisily, another clapping a hand to his mouth in prayer. There was no charitable seller of medicines. Here was a charnel house, a butcher's theater masquerading as science. When they confronted Willoughby with their findings, he did not deny it. He smiled faintly, eyes glittering strangely, and whispered, "You see it? You see how close I am? A century from now, all physicians shall envy me." His tone mingled triumph and madness, a conviction so steady it chilled his accusers more than denial could have. They sealed the cellar, locked the doors, and placed the doctor under watch. But London does not keep horrors hidden long. Within hours, the story spread beyond the parish. By evening, tavern doors burst with the news. Willoughby, the great healer, had been discovered hoarding infant corpses like curiosities. By dawn the next day, crowds gathered outside Cheapside Lane, shouting, spitting, and hurling stones against windows. The authorities tried to quiet them, promising an inquiry, but the mob swelled, chanting for his blood. Newspapers pounced. Broadsheets screamed of "the Doctor of Cheapside" and "the infant's grave robber." Editors described the cellar in unrestrained detail. Jars of flesh, bodies swapped, coffins empty of children. Engravings circulated of a mad-eyed physician looming over copper pots, his hands red with gore. Some of these were fanciful, exaggerated to sell copies, yet the truth required little embellishment, for the facts were grotesque enough. Among people with low incomes, anguish mingled with rage. Women clutched their infants tighter, whispering thanks for children born elsewhere. Men gathered in taverns, plotting vengeance. Threats of dragging Willoughby from his cell to be hanged without trial echoed through narrow streets. Yet among the elite, disquiet took another form. They had dined with him, praised his methods, and encouraged friends to visit his clinic. To admit he was monstrous was to accept their own blindness. Many retreated into silence. A few defended him faintly, murmuring that all science requires specimens, that death in pursuit of discovery was tragedy but not crime. But their voices were drowned out by the fury swelling in Cheapside. The investigation pressed forward. Servants, emboldened now that his power was broken, gave testimony. Anne Hatherley repeated what she had seen, describing jars and the copper pan with terrible precision. Thomas Gray admitted his suspicions about the packages he carried. Robert Ashe detailed his dismissal after glimpsing preserved bodies, recalling the doctor's manic mutterings. Even the laundress, frightened though she was, confessed to cleaning cloth darkened not by childbirth alone, but by deliberate incisions. Each testimony clarified the pattern. Infants born weak or malformed vanished. Mothers who questioned were silenced with assurances, their arms filled with strangers' babies. Healthy infants were preserved, dissected, and labeled for study. Experiments had been attempted, blood transfusions administered, solutions injected, and organs clubbed into clumsy transfers. Each failure was catalogued with cold, neat precision. Not once in his notes did Willoughby speak of comfort, of mercy, of mother's grief. Only variables, only outcomes. The authorities found his journals stacked in neat piles in a mahogany cabinet. They read first with disbelief, then with horror. Terms like donor infant and recipient vessel stained the pages. He detailed attempts to preserve flesh with spirits, attempts to stimulate weak hearts by cutting and sewing with animal sinews. Margins revealed his madness. Life is but quantity, not sanctity. It may be measured, borrowed, replenished. Mothers are vessels only. Children are tools. To the city, the revelation was intoxicating. Every street corner shouted the scandal. It was not merely murder, it was philosophy inverted. The sacred bond of mother and child desecrated. The sanctity of medicine corrupted. Balladeers composed songs mocking the butcher of Cheapside. Children chanted rhymes about his jars, and preachers thundered of hell awaiting the man who had swapped lives as though they were coins. Throughout it all, Willoughby remained unnervingly calm. Imprisoned in a parish chamber while inquiries mounted, he spoke with chilling composure to those who questioned him. He never denied his acts. Instead, he explained. "You misunderstand," he said softly. "I did not kill. I liberated. The weak could not live. Better that their substance strengthen another. I gave mothers children who thrived. I built bridges across mortality." He stared into the faces of his accusers as though sure that one day they would thank him. But London was not inclined to gratitude. By the end of April, public rage had boiled over into a near riot. Crowds gathered by hundreds outside Cheapside, demanding his execution. Shouts of "hang him now" clashed with the cries of grieving women. Authorities, themselves alarmed, feared the mob might overwhelm them, drag him to the gallows in drunken fury. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the weight of society still faltered. Procedure demanded trial, even for monsters. And so preparations began. But each passing night, London seemed on the verge of dragging him out by force. Horace Willoughby, physician turned ghoul in the eyes of his city, had played God in his cellar. Now he faced judgment not only from law, but from thousands of mothers whose arms had held strangers, whose voices rose to curse his name. And still, in his journals, he wrote, "They cannot understand. But centuries will. Mine is the future. Theirs only darkness." By the summer of 1826, there was no corner of London untouched by the name of Horace Willoughby. From the East End taverns where soot-blackened hands slapped ale-stained tables in fury, to the polished tea rooms of Mayfair where whispers disguised as polite gossip carried his story, the doctor of Cheapside had become an obsession. Each person spoke as though they had seen their jars with their own eyes, though most had only read the grotesque broadsheets or heard the ballads sung by London street urchins. The authorities, pressed between public anger and the demands of justice, prepared for the trial of Dr. Willoughby. Never before in memory had there been such a scandal. Physicians were supposed to be guardians of life, men of charity, cloaked in science. But here was one accused of crimes that blurred the line between madness and abomination. The trial would decide not only his guilt, but also assuage the city's thirst for justice. Preparations began in earnest. Witnesses were summoned. Servants, porters, mothers, and clerks. The cellar, that chamber of bottled horror, was sealed and catalogued piece by piece. Each jar was numbered, each label preserved. Officials opened crates with grim lips pressed tight, revealing again what they wished never to see. Infants reduced to specimens, limbs severed, torsos stitched in grotesque experiments. The evidence was stacked in sealed carts and carried under guard to the chamber where the proceedings would unfold. The courthouse, usually a sober hall for routine matters, was transformed into something like a theater. Crowds camped outside days before, clamoring to glimpse the killer doctor. Seats within were scrambled for like relics of saints. Observers, from factory workers to titled lords, flooded in, eager to witness his downfall. London had become hungry, ravenous for vengeance or spectacle. On the opening day, Horace Willoughby was brought forth. His appearance startled the crowd not for savage defiance, but for its calm serenity. He walked erect, his coat immaculate, his step precise. Even in chains, his gaze was steady, pale eyes surveying those assembled as though he were the examiner and they were specimens. Murmurs swept the hall, some expecting a raving madman, others unsettled by his composure. He bowed faintly to the magistrate and sat, folding his hands as though prepared for a lesson rather than judgment. The charges were read aloud, the words echoing across hushed benches. Theft of infants, mutilation, concealment of corpses, deception of mothers, indecent and unlawful experiments upon human life. Each charge fell like a hammer, and when the list concluded, a low growl of outrage escaped the gathered crowd until the magistrate struck for silence. The first witnesses took the stand. Anne Hatherley spoke first, her voice trembling but resolute. She described the cellar, the jars, the copper pan scarred by use. She wept as she recalled the chemical stench that clung to her skirts, but her words painted the scene with a clarity no imagination could exaggerate. The crowd gasped, recoiled, and cursed Willoughby aloud. Next came Thomas Gray, the porter, who swore upon oath that he had carried crates whose weight and form unmistakably resembled infants. He remembered one bundle, stained and seeping, taken to the river under the cover of darkness. His testimony flowed into murmurs of horror, into cries that nearly overwhelmed the magistrate's gavel. Then Robert Ashe, dismissed apprentice, delivered testimony that shook the hall. His voice was unsteady, yet his detail precise. He had seen preserved heads, tiny forms suspended in spirits. He had heard Willoughby mutter of transpositions, of building life as others built bridges. He spoke, Ashe declared, voice breaking, as though we were gods, and mother's grief but trifles in pursuit of his ambition. Finally came the mothers. Margaret Holbrook stood frail but unbowed. She clutched the child she insisted was not hers, now a boy of months but bearing no trace of her husband's features. She laid him gently before the court and wept. "This is no son of mine," she sobbed, though the child burbled innocent sounds. Gasps filled the gallery. Another mother stepped forward, her voice low but steady, telling of twins born but only one returned. The other marked stillborn, though she swore she heard its cries. Their lamentations transformed the trial into something more than a legal proceeding. It became a liturgy of grief, a choir of mourning that demanded vengeance. Through it all, Willoughby sat silent, his expression unreadable. Only when the magistrate commanded his reply did he rise. His voice carried no tremor. "These charges," he began, "are not crimes but misunderstandings of science. I did not kill. I studied. What you call mutilation, I call discovery. These lives you mourn would have expired regardless. I sought only to borrow their strength, to strengthen others, to challenge the tyranny of mortality." The hall erupted with shouts of outrage. The magistrate demanded silence. Willoughby continued unabashed. "Mothers who left my care left with children who lived. Would you condemn me because those children did not emerge exactly as nature in its flawed cruelty had supplied them? I sought to perfect, to purge weakness. There were failures, yes, but failure is a component of triumph. A century hence, when surgeons revive what you call impossible, they will whisper my name, not as criminal but as visionary." His words chilled more than denial would have. To most he sounded not repentant but righteous, a man convinced that his ledger excused the jars of flesh. Some muttered that he was mad, while others said he was evil beyond measure. But all agreed that the city had never seen such arrogance in the face of grief. Day after day, testimony unfolded. Clerks described forged signatures. Constables swore to bundles cast into the Thames waters. Officials opened his journals and read passages aloud until women fainted in the gallery from the horror of words written so calmly. Each page confirmed that the cellar was not an accident, but a deliberate design, not an eugenic fantasy, but a calculated act of murder. Yet Willoughby never faltered. His defense did not deny the deeds. It rationalized them. He spoke of donors and recipients, of the transfusion of vitality, and of building bridges between the weak and the strong. He compared death to currency and himself as the banker of life. His tone, devoid of remorse, only deepened the outrage. The newspapers feasted. Each day, fresh engravings portrayed him, sometimes as a skeletal ghoul, sometimes as a noble patriot betrayed by ignorance. The public devoured every line. In taverns, men shouted that he should be hanged at dawn. In drawing rooms, ladies whispered that no mother should trust again. The city pulsed with a sick fascination. By the trial's third week, it was no longer clear whether London hungered for justice or merely for spectacle. The balconies shook under the weight of onlookers. Vendors sold pamphlets outside describing his confessions. Balladeers sang in rhyme of the cellar jars. When Willoughby was led each day from prison to court, crowds lined the streets, spitting, cursing, casting refuse at him. Yet sometimes among them, a few silent faces stared with unsettling curiosity, as though, despite everything, part of London still wondered if he had glimpsed truths too dreadful for daylight. The magistrate, weary of chaos, pressed the proceedings to hasten. as evidence mounted beyond a doubt. The jars, the testimonies, the missing infants, all formed a web no defense could untangle. When the final arguments were made, none doubted the outcome. On the day of judgment, the hall overflowed. Willoughby stood as the verdict was read, guilty of unlawful mutilation, guilty of infant theft, guilty of concealment, guilty of abomination against moral and natural law. He neither wept nor cursed. He inclined his head faintly as though the words confirmed his destiny. The crowd erupted with cheers mingled with sobs. Mothers wept into one another's arms. Constables fought to hold back men who shouted for the noose to be tightened then and there. Still, the trial of Horace Willoughby left more than judgment in its wake. It left London changed. The bond between physician and patient was cracked, and the line between science and horror was forever blurred. And Horace Willoughby, as he was led back in chains, murmured, "They hate me now. But one day they will come begging, for life always comes begging." The Hall of Justice was silent the morning Horace Willoughby received his sentence. Outside, the streets seethed with chants, clamor rolling like thunder up the stone facades. Mothers clutched portraits of lost children, fathers shouted for the rope, and children sang cruel rhymes of the baby stealer. The entire city was watching. Within, the magistrate's words fell with the solemn cadence of scripture. For acts of cruelty masked as discovery, for the deaths of innocents concealed in jars, for deception of mothers and theft of God's most fragile creation, you, Horace Willoughby, are sentenced to death by hanging. May this judgment serve as final mercy upon your soul, if soul there be. The gavel struck. The hall erupted. Cries and sobs rang against its vaulted ceiling. Reporters leapt to their feet, scribbling furiously. And there, at the center of the storm, Willoughby merely bowed his head with a faint smile, as though hearing approval rather than doom. They carried him back to Newgate Prison, where the condemned awaited their fates. The narrow cell closed around him, a bed of straw, walls oozing damp. Yet still he wrote. Surviving scraps of those final writings tell of no remorse, no fear. Instead, they spoke of vindication to come. They think me a monster. One fragment reads, "One day the needful will forgive. One day my methods shall be demanded, for they do not yet understand that life itself is fluid, a transferable essence. Death is man's illusion, and I, its undoer." The execution was set swiftly, for authorities feared delay might spark mob violence. On the dawn of June 12, 1826, the yards of Newgate swelled with humanity. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, necks craned, torches flickered as anticipation quivered in the air. Executions were always spectacles, but this one bore an eerie weight of vengeance, of purging a nightmare that London had been made to live. Vendors sold broadsheets, tiny woodcut engravings of Willoughby's jarred horrors, medals struck with crude likenesses of his face, captioned, "The Doctor of Death." Ballad singers warbled verses about the copper pan in his cellar, and children squealed them with cruel delight. For hours before sunrise, the mob pulsed and churned with fever to see him swing. At the appointed hour, the gates opened and the condemned were led forth. Willoughby stepped into view dressed in dark wool, collar high, his slender figure unmistakable. A roar swallowed the street, jeers, cries, venom spat through clenched teeth. Stones were hurled toward him, though constables parried them away. Still, he walked with measured step, his gaze not fixed on the crowd but lifted somewhere distant, as if above them. Upon the scaffold, the executioner bound his wrists and draped the noose. The magistrate read the charge once more. Silence spread like fog until only the creak of rope could be heard. Asked for final words, Willoughby spoke plainly, his voice carrying with unsettling calm. "You call me murderer. I call myself a physician. You call me a thief of children. I call myself a steward of strength. Mock me in life. Curse me in death, but the future will remember. For what I began, death shall not end. It will be taken up, refined and perfected, and you all, yes, even you, will beg for its fruits." The crowd erupted a storm of curses. Mothers shrieked, men shook fists, and clergy cried prayers to drown him out. The executioner worked the lever. The trap gave way. Rope snapped taut. Horace Willoughby's body jerked, twitched. A sigh rippled through the mob, like the release of a held breath. Yet even as life fled him, some swore the faint curl of defiance lingered upon his lips. Whether truth or fancy, that image stamped itself into London's imagination. the mad doctor who died smiling at his own damnation. The body was left hanging as the custom demanded, then cut down and carried not to consecrated earth but to a surgeon's hall, that irony not lost on those who whispered it. There his corpse was dissected for students, his flesh stripped, his bones catalogued. They studied the hands that had altered so many others' fates, the skull said to house a genius twisted to ghastly ends. To some, his body's dissection was justice. To others, it was fitting punishment for one who had treated others as specimens. London was left scarred. Mothers in every district regarded physicians with new suspicion. Parish officials turned stricter, inspecting every report of childbirth, every burial certificate. Midwives, once dismissed by gentlemen doctors, found sudden grim respect among women who now preferred familiar hands to professional strangers. Whispers clung to every clinic. Are they another Willoughby? Yet fascination mingled with fear. Pamphlets spread retelling his methods in lurid prose. Cheap engravings decorated with jars and the infamous copper pan were sold in the markets. Writers argued whether he was mad or brilliant ahead of his time. Preachers thundered that he was proof of science severed from God, a soul led astray by hubris. Children sang cruel jingles in alleyways long after his body rotted. But the deepest scar lay in those mothers who never knew the truth of the infants exchanged, stolen, or preserved. Some still watched children grow in homes never theirs, clinging to doubt with every new feature they could not recognize. Some carried graves in their memory, picturing coffins filled with stone instead of flesh. For them, the execution marked no closure. It was justice for the man, but not for the silence left in their cradles. Historians later debated the extent to which his experiments were successful. Some argued he was but a madman of one cellar, a solitary butcher. Others whispered of networks across Europe, of colleagues who, though they feigned disgust, read his journals with trembling fascination. Letters discovered years later suggested correspondence with foreign physicians interested in exchanges of vitality, though no proof of cooperation could be fixed. Still, the thought was enough to haunt. The legacy of Horace Willoughby endures not merely in horror tales, but in reform. Laws were tightened. Documentation of births and deaths became stricter. The Anatomy Act years later bore whispers of his shadow, ensuring bodies could no longer vanish unrecorded. Ethical councils formed to reorient science within moral boundaries. In his grotesque way, he shaped medicine not by discovery but by forced caution. Yet stories rarely end so neatly. In 1867, more than 40 years later, workers restoring a property near Cheapside unearthed a sealed jar buried beneath floorboards, clouded with age, within which floated what none wished to name. Some called it fraud, while others referred to it as a relic. It was quietly taken and hidden, perhaps destroyed, but rumors never died. They whispered Willoughby had buried more than one vessel beneath London. Those pieces of his curiosity still waited in the cracks of the city. In taverns, mothers still told the tale to hush unruly children. Sleep now, or Dr. Willoughby will come with his jars. His name entered folklore as a specter, a cautionary shadow just as strong as any ghost of London fog. He had sought to master life, to exchange its essence, but what he achieved was to brand himself immortal in dread. The doctor who swapped babies to cover up his design, who turned infants into entries in ledgers, who smiled at his rope with unrepentant pride, and when London moved on, building railways, erecting new factories, and drowning itself in smoke and progress, his tale lingered beneath. For cities cannot so easily bury the ghosts of their own children. If stories like this give you chills, share them with a friend who loves forgotten horrors. When the rope at Newgate snapped Dr. Horace Willoughby's neck, London exhaled as though the city itself had been holding its breath. Yet the execution, for all its spectacle, did not erase the shadow he cast. In some ways it deepened it, for long after his body was cut down and dissected, long after the copper pan was broken with hammers, his name lingered at the edges of whispers and memory. Victorian society was quick to claim lessons. Officials promised that no physician would again be allowed such secrecy. Clerks tightened their ledgers. Parishes demanded greater accountability for births, deaths, and burials. Indeed, a swell of reform was born from the horror, stricter proof for every child delivered, every coffin lowered, every mother who cried foul. The Anatomy Act, which would pass years later, gained urgency from his crimes. No longer could corpses vanish into lecture halls or basements without a trace. No longer could infants be swapped like ledger coin through the fog of official ignorance. Still, the scars ran deeper than law. For women, especially those from low-income backgrounds, trust in male physicians waned. Mothers who once sought safety in gentlemen clinics now whispered to prefer old midwives, gnarled with years but loyal in heart. "I will not risk another Willoughby," they told one another. "My child will lie in arms I know." Midwives, long dismissed by men of science, found renewed purpose, a grim vindication delivered by one man's downfall. Meanwhile, the newspapers refused to let the story die. They printed engravings again and again, his pale face on the scaffold, his sinister jars in cellar gloom. Some papers vilified him as a ghoul, worse than any demon. Others, more dangerously, portrayed him as a brilliant mind ruined by excess zeal, his work tragic but not entirely without reason. Such accounts unsettled London further, for they reminded readers that his confidence had been chillingly rational. He had believed every word he spoke. Children born in the years after grew up with his name turned into a myth. Mothers threatened, "Sleep now, or Willoughby will take you to his jars." Schoolboys dared one another to walk Cheapside Lane after dark, swearing his shadow could still be glimpsed in the lantern glow. Ballads joined nursery rhymes, and the Doctor of Cheapside became as much bogeyman as historical villain. But fascination has its own teeth. Even as preachers thundered that his name should be wiped from memory, quiet collectors sought his remnants. Loose pages of his journals appeared on black markets, traded at significant sums to men who whispered of advancements buried too soon. There were rumors that physicians abroad were reading his theories, cloaking them in more palatable language, and pursuing dark ideas under different names. None were proven, yet each rumor gave weight to his final claim, that what he began would not end with his death. As the decades passed, society gilded over much of its dirt with steel rails and the empire's shine, but occasionally the past clawed through. In 1867, when workers uncovered a sealed jar beneath floorboards near Cheapside, dread surged anew. Official reports were quiet, stamped confidential. Witnesses swore it contained unmistakably human remains, suspended in a clotted spirit that was over 40 years old. The jar was buried secretly, perhaps smashed, yet its unearthing confirmed what many already believed, that Willoughby's cellar had been deeper than known, his reach longer than imagined. Modern historians who study the case still debate his character. Was he an earnest visionary pushed into madness by obsession, or a sadist cloaking cruelty in scholarly ink? His journals suggest both methodical calculation, lined with whispers of genius, yet each entry smudged by ambition stripped of conscience. He had sought to exchange life, treating it as a commodity. Whether delusion or discovery, the sheer scale of his violation. Scores of mothers deceived, infants treated as raw material, left scars no century could fully heal, and so Horace Willoughby endures not simply as a villain, but as a warning. His story reminds us of progress's darkest twin, that in pursuit of a miracle, man can become a monster when he severs compassion from curiosity. Victorian London clothed him in shadows, made his name a ghost, sang his jars to frighten babes. Yet in truth, the horror lay not in the jars themselves, but in the certainty of the man who filled them. Stand today at Cheapside Lane and the townhouse is gone, swallowed by newer facades, its cellar bricked and buried beneath modern stone. Shoppers wander by, unaware of the ground beneath their feet, ignorant of the screams once muffled behind its shuttered windows. Yet London remembers in curious ways. Local lore persists that the fog there is thicker, the air tainted faintly sharp, as though a ghost of chemical reek lingers still. Some claim to hear faint cries when the night is windless. Some swear shadows stir where no lantern burns. Perhaps imagination, perhaps memory given voice. Or possibly, as Willoughby himself warned, his kind was never singular. For his final words on the scaffold, he clung harder than the rope. What I began, death shall not end. 2 centuries have passed, and medical progress has advanced into miracles that Willoughby could only dream of. Transfusions are real, organ transfers are real, vitality is borrowed and passed across lives, but bound now by laws of ethics and consent forged in blood, forged in horror. In the end, his prediction came true, though not as he imagined. The world did take up his ideas, but not his cruelty. He is remembered not as a pioneer, but as a monster whose shadow warned medicine that it must chain itself to morality. Yet ask beneath the surface, and fascination still runs. Books retell him, plays dramatize him, collectors trade fragments said to be his notes, though most are forgeries. And in the dark corners of our imagination, his pale eyes continue to linger, asking if our fear is truly of him, or of the possibility that another like him might one day rise, cloaked in reason, polished in brass, smiling gently as he promises miracles. The tale of Horace Willoughby is closed in grave and gallows, yet open in warning. For London remembers, and we remember, that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the measured syllables of science, in the calm smile of a gentleman, in a clinic with fresh linens and spotless brass. And sometimes it carries the weight of a swaddled child who is not the child you bore. This is the story of 1824 London, the doctor who swapped babies to cover up his experiments. It has lingered through centuries, not simply as true crime, but as caution carved into history's bones. If you found yourself chilled by this account, subscribe now so you never miss the hidden terrors, forgotten crimes, and shadows of history brought to light. Like this story to support our work and leave a comment below. Tell us where you are listening from and what you believe. Was Horace Willoughby mad, or was he in some twisted vision ahead of his time? The ledger is closed. The execution is done. But his ghost still lingers in the London fog.